So today we have with us Professor Teresa Dillon, who's an artist and a researcher, lives between Berlin and Bristol in the UK. She's a professor at the Center for Arts and Design at the University of West England, and she's a professor of urban futures. Teresa and I have worked together on several kinds of projects in the past, so it's a real pleasure to have her here with us. I think she's speaking from Berlin. Thank you, Teresa, for joining me today.
Thanks, Ravi. Great to be here.
And so this is, as we've been having these conversations, you have an opportunity to react to my images if you like to, and then we carry on with the conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate the set here really in a way, because I think that so much it resonates a lot with the line of work that that I'm also interested in, and that line of work relating to human, non-human relations, and the non-human specifically referring here to animal, bird, species relations. And I think the set here in terms of the captivity, the ceremony, extinction, contamination, germination, and classification really orders a lot, provokes a lot in terms of our, in terms of actually how we live in an everyday conscious and unconscious way, maybe with other creatures. And I'm specifically, I guess, thinking through the debates that have been circulating around animal welfare and animal rights, which is kind of what I sort of hold here. And in particular, a conversation that has been happening also more recently around the popularity of the discourse of non-human relations, speaking to how we privilege some non-human relations above others as well. And in particular within that, how there has been within the artistic discourse and practice and academic practice, often a preference to speaking about relationships with, the wild creature, in a sense, with the undomesticated or the ones that we don't eat. So we somehow have like a more poetic imaginary to the wolf, for example, or to the feral in some way. And I think here, and we forget then that on an everyday basis, in any particular city or town or place, of course, because of our level of meat consumption, we are, slaughtering and sacrificing and raising and breeding in quite bizarre conditions when you start to look at those in a microscopic way, and even not in a microscopic way, in a really general way, the conditions under which we have relationships with other creatures. It becomes quite, it's violent, it's abusive, it's violent, it's disgusting. If you were to think about the sentientness of another creature, the feeling or the emotion of it, it becomes quite shocking, really, kind of what we're kind of currently doing. And I often think about this in the popularity of, like, I love cooking and we'll often just watch cooking programs or read, recipes and so forth. And like the dominance of meat in our culture is still so, particularly on TV cooking programs. I was actually just thinking about it this morning, and probably triggered by your invitation, how recently we have a competition in England called the National Bake Off competition. And in the recent series, one particular young woman wanted to just bake vegan cakes, okay? And so she was the first, I think, contestant to propose that as a possibility, not to use butter, not to use milk, not to use dairy products. And she got kind of far in the competition, but of course, many of the expectations or the recipes that were required as part of the competition, that they would be asked to bake within a couple of hour period on the show, aren't propped up for supporting vegan cooking, aren't propped up for supporting relationships with relationships with species that don't involve products from them, you know. And again, I was like watching another cooking program most recently, and they were just cooking for Christmas, you know. And it's just this the kind of everyday perpetuation that we have. So I think, you know, when I see your set of pictures here, they kind of call up all of the deeply embedded, you know, propagation of ways that we have to be with another creature that we would have to untangle if we were to really start to truly speak to this equality, these equal rights when it comes to human and non-human relationships. And the paper that I shared with you, which will be published soon in the Journal of Human Rights and the Environment, which is specifically speaking about post-human legalities. And it's a journal that my colleague, Professor Anna Greer, who is Professor of Law at Cardiff University, who's very well known for her work on sort of thinking through and beyond ways in which we have relationships with the environment in terms of the a kind of an anthropocenic sort of thinking. You know, how do we go beyond the centralization of the human self? And I guess I'm sort of, you know, skipping from your picture set, you know, and what that has kind of, first of all, sort of stimulates, to then thinking through that particular paper, and a point that I came to within my own practice and within this conversation as well, about what does it actually start to truly mean if we are to honor that call of the human, the non-human, which for me has kind of come from Indigenous thinking, feminist scholarship, new materialism, the environmental humanities. And reading that literature, in a way, I kind of kept coming up to a sort of a but point, you know, but yes, this is okay. You know, we can have these sublime moments of connectivity with another creature, often when we take ourselves out of our everyday or our urban environments and we go for walks in the countryside, or perhaps at the best of it, we have a very close relationship with a pet. Yeah, let's not forget that relationship as well. Which I guess in some ways relates to your picture about captivity, one could say, but maybe could be another picture to place. You know, you could have had a picture of a pet there that I think would have complemented this set that you had. So I was reading this work and I was coming to this kind of but point, as I say, and I was like thinking, but how do we engender this thinking, this move that we need to make, so that we have a different ontological perspective on the world when we have these conditions in which are so deeply embedded in how we live, in terms of the cooking practices, in terms of the eating practices, in terms of, you know, animal care and pet practices. What can you start to do from an artistic perspective? And for me, this came down to this particular point around ritual. Mm-hmm. And ritual being a mechanism and an effective strategy and a means through which you rise above the everyday, you enter into a third space that's also a sacred and a held space, or a magical space, or a liminal space. You know, it works in all of these kind of capacities, mm-hmm. where I can maybe start to sort of foster what that relationship might look like in these current circumstances that I'm still having to live within, mm-hmm. where we slaughter millions of animals a day
Right.
to keep our food cycles going. Or, I think that, the statistics that I've read on pet relationships, there's more pets than people living together in America, for example. Like the rise of pets in the last couple of decades is astounding. The cost over COVID of a pet has, I don't know what it's like in India, but it went bonkers in the UK and England and Europe. It tripled in prices. So we have these very complicated relations of entanglement with animals, while at the same time stepping into this discourse where I think intuitively and academically, and I say intuitively, meaning that as human beings currently living in the planet at this particular moment in time, where there is news every day of the great derangement that we're living within and the great unraveling, that I think as a species, we intuitively know that something needs to be done, right? Because we are interconnected. We do feel these changes. We are part of the same nervous system, aka Gaia. So we know that something needs to change, but at the same time, we can't imagine ourselves out of it yet properly. And for me, the work that as an artist I do, and I have to do, I say, is part of that imagination.
Right.
And that's where the ritual work started to unfold.
So let's talk, I want to come back to the ritual in greater detail, because I think it's a very interesting place to talk about in this context. But also your paper, which is actually a brilliant paper on multi-species entanglements in urban spaces. I think I'm just paraphrasing the title.
Yes.
So you choose to look at this in an urban space. So so the two questions which might help us to understand is, what is this urban space you're thinking of? What kind of urbanism or what kind of space are you thinking of? And why is this entanglement different than other places? And what are the specific entanglements which you find interesting? Because urban space is also your academic field at the university, right?
Yeah, an urban space in a way, and its associated spatial arrangements is kind of my canvas. I would sort of say also it's the context, the human habitat that I have gravitated to for nearly, over nearly 2 decades as a very interesting place to start to understand human life at this particular moment in time. And in that period of time, around, I think, just early 2012, was it 2008, I believe, I think, we tipped into a globally urban kind of world.
Right.
Now, urban, of course, urban refers to both the city, sort of city in a sense, and the peri-urban at this moment, and the broader conglomerate of what we kind of, define as urban now is quite a large kind of space. Specifically, I guess, I'm speaking to the density within cities, where we have a spatial arrangement that perhaps means that you need to go at least 2 to 3 hours out from the center to perhaps go into what we call countryside. Okay, so when I was writing that paper, I was thinking about somebody living in central London or central Berlin or central Paris, for example, or any, central New Delhi, where their encounter on what is the encounter we have then with animals, specifically animals, in this kind of day-to-dayness. And a lot has been written about encounters with pigeons, encounters with rats. When we go to this non-human kind of jargon, non-human discourses, again, the kind of these feral relationships tended to kind of come a little bit to the fore, right? And as I mentioned, you know, there's this like more recent body of work then that has been speaking to, okay, but they're sort of instances, yeah? But when we actually are, again, sitting in these dense urban spaces, you know, right across the road from you, you have maybe the restaurant that's, you know, just killing and chucking, you know, animals out the door on a daily basis. We don't maybe think about that as that non-human encounter, right? But you do think the pigeon might raise that moment of non-human animal encounter with you. And then the other layer of course, animal relationship in these dense spaces is the pets that we might have.
Right.
And I was struck by a text that I was writing, or I was reading. It was actually a Dickens book that I had somehow just picked up one day, and I was just reading it. And he was speaking, of course, to the Victorian city, where another type of animal life was very much present and in your face all of the time, because people would have had horses, chickens, pigs, you know, butchering in a different kind of way. It was very present within the cities. And I started to think about these moments of when do we actually look at another animal in the eye? You know, what does that moment of encounter, where does that moment of encounter happen within the city, within the contemporary city? Now, New Delhi is a good example where actually that moment of encounter can actually happen with the cow in a way that doesn't happen on the streets of London. Absolutely. Okay. And for me, that already holds potential of an ontological shift, right? That is extremely different way of engaging and thinking through what that animal's position might hold in my broader consciousness. And we can also speak of Hindu religions actually, you know, holding deities that are human and animal simultaneously. So your culture already has a presence everyday beat, so to speak, or a habit, let's say a habit that can enable maybe that perspective, that doorway, that crossroads to be sat upon in a much more different way than a person who's sitting maybe in a flat in the center of London. And that's kind of where I was thinking from. And I was thinking, well, okay, but how does that person sitting in a flat in the center of London, who might love their pet and have a pet, right? But what about the person who doesn't have a pet, right? Or who thinks that the pigeon is really messy and dirty and should be exterminated, right? Yes. How from that position do we start to create possibilities for habitual responses? Because I do believe that habit and practice is a way through which we can change our worldviews, right? But those habits and practices have to be made available to us, and they have to be legitimized. And so again, this is where I came back to this ritual perspective. Well, what happens if we make particular types of ritual normalized, that it is normal for us to have a weekly ceremony in a city that actually acknowledges the amount of cows that we just slaughtered and ate in all our restaurants, or all of the chickens, or that gives thanks to all of the animals that we have in a zoo, you know, or, you know, and if that vibration is actually potentially caused, then I think it creates the space or the opening for for you to then engage in that hard ontological conversation that needs to be made to start to kind of speak more deeply through this conversation of welfare or rights, you know, because the welfare side of the conversation, which essentially boils down to once the animal is cared for and has a good life and is supported in a good way and has a good death, then we can essentially kind of do what we want with it.
Yeah.
The rights, of course, puts that position in a much harder level, where it's sort of saying, no, this entity is equal to me.
Yeah.
So actually, I can't just treat them well. I actually have to kind of consider, their perspective in the world. Right now, Isabella Stringer brings this up as like, how do I speak on behalf of the raven?
Right.
And so this ritual I was doing recently for climate care, which is a program that runs at the Floating University in Berlin, was again that kind of provocation, okay, which led to this methodology that I'm sort of slowly developing at the moment, which is actually based on guided visual meditation, where I hold a workshop with people, and prior to the
what is
holding
guided
the work,
visual when you meditate and you imagine?
Yes, exactly. And what I do in preparation for that is I research the actual reproductive system of the plant or the species, right? And I use that as the basis or the text through which to then guide a guided visual meditation. So very often, if I was to ask you, if you stood outside of your house and you just looked around at like what trees and plants and creatures might be around, and I asked you something about their actual life cycle, you might not know very much.
Correct.
And I think this is another way to respect another creature or species, is to actually just understand their life cycle. In the same way that it is essential for a man and a woman to be able to live together, or any human to live together, by understanding one's own life cycle, reproductive, biological systems.
You acknowledge it in a different way.
You acknowledge it in a different way. You start to understand the other, also appreciate the other, love the other in another.
That's the purpose of the guided meditation.
That's the purpose, yeah. So I came upon this technique as a methodology through which to. This was something super recent in my let's say trajectory in this space, which also kind of emerged from doing this sort of practice, performative ritual practice, and writing and thinking about it. It's kind of like, okay, well, if I can create spaces through which we can enter into a consciousness of another's life cycle, then again, it opens up these possibilities for having that conversation about what it might mean to decenter ourselves in a way. And all of this then kind of brought me to a point where I was having very interesting conversations with legal scholars, as I mentioned, and my colleague Andres at the Westminster Legal Theory Lab as well. We have also been, I would say, pottering still around these topics in our kind of conversations as well. But
yeah. In your paper, you also mentioned the encounter of the snowy owl with the surveillance camera, I think, and you talk about, I think, reversing that gaze, if I've understood it correctly.
Exactly, reversing the gaze, yeah.
And so you talk of these multiple encounters which the animals, or the non-human world has in a city space, which has its own infrastructure and own power dynamics and own power equations, in a sense. So there's a physical space, but there's also a particular kind of cultural and political space in which these exist, in a sense. And it struck me as very unusual research, because looking at this in a particular kind of space with a certain characteristic, as a marker of how the relationships could be, and possibly different than what they could be in other encounters outside. And you mentioned about this ontological moment of meeting the eye of the cow, in a sense. So these are sort of very interesting for me axes of inquiries, in a sense, and they open up a host of very complex questions, some of which you mentioned, like about the legal issues, the rights issues, and also my particular history of encounters with trying to campaign for urban forests and using biodiversity as one of the campaign messaging that, but then in an urban space, decentering the human, because the urban space is so powerfully human.
Yeah.
It is geared and so powerfully masculine, because, you know, I mean, you see that very much in here in India, that they're very masculine spaces and also not very disabled friendly. So they are very sort of human in a very particular kind of human way, in a very specific kind of human way. They're not even always gender friendly or disabled or you know, physically challenged friendly, in a sense. You have to be this particular kind of person to be. And the roads are also where the might is right in how you drive, in a sense. So the animal, the non-human, is so far down the ladder, so dispensable, maybe as a site in a zoo. So to me, when you talk of this ontological shift or the contact in that space, this sort of brings up another possibility, in a sense, of how to rupture that huge power structure in an urban, very, very human power structure in a space. So I don't know if you have anything to say about, you know, when you think about how you're saying you're pottering around these legal questions, and where does this pottering take you, in a sense? How do we think about this? What are the possibilities? Because the legal question is another set of questions which are very complicated and difficult to move from the current frameworks of how legal frameworks of justice operate. Because justice to animals, you talked about justice to, you know, of how we think of the good life of the animal, in a sense, you know, and so there's so many layers of complexity in. So how should we proceed in this? How should we think about this? How should we, and also as an artist, what kind of, you mentioned about acknowledging through visual meditation. What are the possibilities? I mean, these are sort of host of questions which come to my mind when you talk about your detailed encounters. So
yeah,
just reflect, I would just curious to know how you think about all this and where do you think it might go?
Yeah, so I think to go back to that point with the city, you know, you were mentioning there, you know, these masculine center points, in a sense. You can argue that it's basically the city is the heightened form of our kind of capital logic at this moment. It's their heightened forms of extraction, in a way, and they're condensed and dense in that sense. So trying, as you say, to think through how you foreground other species in this densely human capital, masculine centric, patriarchal centered spaces is almost an impossibility, you could argue, right? You're going, well, what are you trying to do, Teresa? Unravel, reverse engineer thousands of years of history and trade, you know, because they're based on, most urban centers are based on trade routes and trade centers, and therefore that capitalist logic, right?
Right.
So the impossibility, I think, is the challenge, actually, to soften these edges, right? Soften this power, this hold, okay? And that is, but also at the same time, we know that cities are lively centers of othering and difference and change and dynamicness all of the time, right? But it goes back to this point of how do you create a beat? How do you create habits within a city that start to enable these recognitions of other creatures? Now, in Japan, for example, you have graveyards for pets. You know, you don't have this culture so much in Europe, and that's also, of course, part of a Buddhist logic that's at play there too. For example, or you have in India the cow on the street. Okay, the point, I guess, of the work that I'm thinking through is that if you can create habits and habits through ritual, and ritual in its performative power, and it's all the relations that need to kind of go into that, you have possibility in that performative moment of creating an opening that can lead to this potential shift, right? But that opening then has to then be backed up by other forms of practices, which are educational and which are discursive.
Right.
And the discursive for me then lands within these conversations that I'm having with my legal colleagues, in a sense, about how you then create, once you have created this, like the power of the performative moment, that the power of the art moment to just like go boom, yeah, it opens the door. And then you can kind of bring into a layer after that, then the staging for a discussion around animal welfare and rights that may not have been present before. But then you have to kind of like support that into the next layer, which I think, which for me is also within this educational, coming from an educational practice as well. What does that mean in relation to how we support these conversations in primary and in secondary school? You know, and it's interesting because over COVID, I was having these moments with my niece and nephews online where I actually sort of tried out some of this, you know. Yeah, just showing them. It was with my nieces and my nephews and my friend Rod's kids and my neighbors. And they're all ranging from the ages of about 7 to 11. Yeah. And we started to talk about animal rights and animal welfare, and also then different Indigenous thinking, particularly how you could read, for example, an Aborigine painting. And the relationships then that, of course, are in those cultures, which are, and actually in traditional pagan Irish cultures as well, which acknowledge very much these respectful relationships, I would say, or this entanglement, or this interconnectedness that is not such a chasm, you know, in a way, in the thinking. And I was interested to see how they would respond to this material, and whether they would, you know, their capacity to kind of understand it, gravitate towards it. They got it.
Really?
Ravi. They get it. They get it. Of course it is. Because we are just another animal. In the end of the day, we are another animal in the world, you know. And
when
you can
say they get it, what does that mean?
They get it in the sense that you can start to have we ended up having a conversation, which, without them knowing, was the animal welfare, animal rights conversation. You know, which is like, well, no, I think it's okay to eat an animal if you care for that animal, or if you take care of it and has a good life, or if, you know, this aspect. And then the other, which was a 9-year-old vegetarian, it's like, no, because the animal feels.
9-year-old vegetarian.
Yeah, I don't think it's a good idea.
By choice.
But yes, well, her parents are quite liberal and open. I couldn't speak exactly to how, but you know, the point is that she's like, no, the creature has feelings. I don't like to eat things that have feelings. So we have the capacity as, you know, as living creatures ourselves to understand intuitively some of these conversations. It just, we prop ourselves up in the world by having schooling systems and educational discourses that are still enabling us to just lean into particular directions of extraction, really, you know, and start to remove some of those. And you get to a point where people can start to have a conversation. Now, further level that up, of course, and you start to have very hard conversations, because basically, so, you know, the amount of, it's a bit like trying to live without petrol, you know. and it's also not, you know, where are the limits of these things? I haven't all those, I have no answers for all of those things, you know.
Of course, I mean, but this is very interesting, your constant sort of trying this out in a sense of where the boundaries lie and how permeable those boundaries are, you know, with like the children.
Exactly, but here's another wonderful story, right? So my friends, I work with a bunch of female practitioners who are called Soft Agency, and Soft Agency run, Rosie and Gilly in particular, curate climate care at the Floating University. And they know about this work that I'm doing, so they hosted a ritual there, and also they hosted a conversation with a young researcher that was asked to leave his house, right, or his flat in Berlin, but then tried to encourage a bat to live with him, right?
Bat.
So a bat, right? So he could claim that actually this endangered species, you know, has a privilege and he's living with them, and so, you know, it was a hack. It's this like, you know, it's using an animal. It is using an animal, right? But it's using an animal to say, hey, but wait now, my house is actually a bat sanctuary. My flat is a bat sanctuary. You can't move me out, because actually, if you move me out, you disturb the bat, and just me and the bat live together, you know.
Right.
And it's just like, yeah, these are kind of ways to, I think, provoke the openings that we need to kind of do. And I mean, I look at this picture that you have of classification, and I just like, you know, when I think I think probably a very emotive thing that happened to me several years ago, I'm talking now 2013, I had a residency in Vienna in museums quartz, and I walked into the wonderful museums that they have in Vienna, but one of them was the Natural History Museum, essentially. And it was just room and room and room of carcass
yeah.
And I actually ended up sitting in the room crying, actually, and just saying sorry repeatedly. It was like, I hadn't been, I think, maybe in a museum like this for a long time, or like maybe since I was a child going on a school tour or something. So there'd been this like long period of not being confronted with that like visual like shock, you know. I think this is somehow very tied to where some of this work started for me also. Yeah. You know, and I think it's important to say I speak also from this, having growing up in a farming community, in a farming context, where since I was a child, I was witness and seeing and standing beside the birth and the slaughter of animals. It's not like they were foreign. That was foreign to me, and you know, meat and two veg.
What happened in that museum room? What got triggered off?
I think the destruction, the scale of this destruction, because this was just Yeah.
Show them all together.
Yeah, and knowing that this is just one museum of many museums.
Right.
And how, I mean, I also used to love these museums as well when I was a kid. I love rocks, so I always had this fascination with rocks. So these kind of museums were always something we would visit, or I would visit. But I don't think I had stepped into the species hole for a while, you know.
Right.
And we know that there is you know, the decolonial agenda that's going on at this moment in time with museums, which is you know, important to see, both in terms of giving back objects and returning them to their cultures. Like, where does this sit when it comes to the creatures as well? You know, and there's other projects that are bubbling on these kind of topics as well for me, as in a way too, and this glorification of the species, because you also, you know, have the picture of the bat here with the kind of the contamination in a sense. I think contamination there goes both ways, of course, but again, this point, I think the contamination picture that you shared is very resonant in relation to this conversation of COVID that we had, because again, during COVID, in this first period of this lockdown, Reiben are an arts collective in France, and they were actually doing an online radio show, and they invited me to participate in it. And this is also when I started again to refine some of these practices of ritual, and it was sort of like chanting and kind of bringing forth these storylines around the understanding that we had in terms of how COVID emerged in Wuhan at the time, in the markets, in the animal markets, where the conversation in the news and in the science articles at this moment were how we have destroyed the green barriers, right, around the urban centers to such a point that actually the wild animals are coming into these sort of domestic and semi-domestic spaces, and the crossing diseases, and then the fetish, from what I understood, in particular food markets, of eating wild animals as well. Right. And that, and then it was the perigolin, is it, the animal, the scaly animal, yeah, that was kind of exactly as and you know, this had this actual particular animal with its like scaly armor, and also considered as you know, in some medicinal remedy, it scales as well, you know, this kind of, you know, these relationships with these particular types of creatures like bats and the scaly ones, in a sense, it also produces an imagination that's you know, sort of somehow vampirish, you know, as well, and then leads you again into these I want to sort of say broader sort of circles of, let's call it like magic in a sense, you know, and where this borders on the ceremonial and also on religion, and also on lines of respect, and also on lines of relationship, and transformations of body and mutations of body, and, you know, what is the human in the end of the day? You know, I'm fungi, I'm bacteria, I'm viral. Right. I'm water. Entangled human body. Human is almost, I mean, that's maybe where maybe Ravi, that's where it lands, you know. The human is, when you talk about these classifications that you speak through your pictures of, the human is possibly one of the most falsified categorizations of life. Right. That we have. So many things. You know. I want to speak briefly to you about your rituals, because I think that's an artistic mode of, if I may, you will say that, you know, the attempt at an ontological shift through creating new habits. You know. So what is this can you describe a ritual to me? And
what kind? It's like a performance you do, or
Yes, it's a performance. Yeah, my background is in performance studies, theater, and you know, I mean, and set design as well. That's kind of, if I have, you know, my formal trainings are in these disciplines. And there's this wonderful stage director called Peter Brook,
yes.
you know, who essentially says the minute you draw the circle, you know, you create the space. And this is essentially what my formation is, in a sense. The minute you create that particular spatial arrangement, you have the potential to create a performance, and then that, you know, heightens our sense, you know, because you call it out, you know, and then therefore you enter into a whole dramaturgy, really, in a way. And I think, you know, ritual has both. Ritual can feel sometimes, perhaps for somebody who may have grown up in a religious doctrine, like too closed or too dogmatic in a particular direction. But I use it in, dare I say, a liberal kind of way, more from that performance background, more from that the theatre background of creating space and creating dramaturgy and a heightened sense of attention towards particular relationships within a space. And so perhaps the easiest one to kind of walk through, well, they all sort of take a little bit of a similar direction at this particular moment in time over the last 2 years, is, for example, Calling into the Now, which happened in this summer. Looked at the reeds, the water reeds that were in the particular space around the floating university. As I mentioned, I researched their reproductive system and their life cycle, hosted a workshop, did the guided visual meditation through that. Post that meditation, asked the participants of the workshop to just write down their impressions from this almost 2.5 hour long kind of, it's like, that's kind of quite a bit of time to meditate, in a sense. Those texts then I combined to write the text for essentially what I spoke during this actual performative moment in front of an audience, where I worked with a musician and a drummer called Gordon W., who was playing some sacred drums, and he opened up I mean, this is all outside, so he opened up the moment. And there was, due to the architecture of the site, a lot of these dry reeds. So I sort of created a path using them, which also had this sonic kind of quality. So you see me gathering them and making this path, and then I bring it out to sort of the waterfront, and then I pick up a microphone and I address the reeds, asking how I can speak in their name.
Right. Asking the permission.
Yes.
Say.
Yeah. Well, asking the reeds what it is. Sorry, what did you just say?
Like asking the permission or their agreement.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. And thinking through Isabel's. I'm also thinking about Vincent Despret's text about, you know, how to speak on behalf of animals and how to speak on behalf of ravens, you know, and I'm facing the reeds and I'm sort of going, what is it that I need to do to speak in your name?
Right.
Perhaps I need to learn about your form. And then I speak to the form. Okay, you grow to 2.5, 3 meters. You have a flowery head. You contain male and female parts. You have a rhizome. We use every part of you. We eat you. We can make mats from you. Okay, then I say, perhaps I need to listen to you. Then I just hold that sound of listening to the reeds. perhaps I need to dream with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the context, in a sense. So ritual is performance. You know, the classic markers of a ritual, some of them are there.
Yeah.
But am I demanding a rite of passage, so to speak, with the other participants? No, not in the same sense. A eulogy to the soil, for example, that happened in Paris sort of also kind of works. It's a sort of other form of storytelling, you know. We converted, it was a garden space. This was for Nuit Blanche, which is the White Night, which happens in Paris every year. And I was one of the invited artists to participate in, again, which was a urban public spaces. We inhabited a garden. Within the garden, there was a yurt. We transformed the yurt into a very kind of meditative space. You know, we blackened it out. We put down some prayer chairs, so to speak, created a sort of an altar to plants that were particular to that garden. And the area which this garden had emerged from was on the outer skirts of Paris, which had been contaminated, polluted. The garden, the soil had been very polluted because of industrial waste. Mm-hmm. And the gardeners in the garden was remediated. And many of the plants that were there were for soil remediation. But then the history of that whole area, that's sort of what I researched and looked at. And then that was transmitted, because it was during COVID last year, with 3 screens, all of which took one particular plant, which is the alpha, sort of a alpha seed, which is a very interesting crop that was sort of emerged in the Middle East. It was grown essentially for hay and cows and cattle, transported to America. It's like a long story with these species germination and development. And but spoke to that. But on each of the screens, the plant was just crumbling and dying and disappearing. Yeah. And then I come on and I do a sort of a spoken word text. So this, you know, I guess part of the work I think of what I'm doing as well is storytelling.
Yes.
And creating these performative moments that also hold a spoken word moment or a story encapsulated within them, that kind of creates this layered effect, which I guess I'm speaking to as a kind of a ritual, because it's trying to draw your attention to and trying to slow down time. And I think that's the power of a ritual. It changes our experience of time in a particular moment. And that's one of the things that, again, how do we work towards creating these ontological shifts? We sort of need to sometimes decolonize the mind and step out of, you know, this chronological time that we're experiencing, to kind of experience, you know, subjective time in a different kind of way, really.
I think this is like creating new stories, new myths, and new rituals, which embed these stories and these myths. So, and I think it's the ritual as the point of unlocking, as the point of embedding all these things of opening up something else, the new ontology, a new sense, a new relationship. I think it's extremely powerful and interesting strategy or mechanism, or whatever word you want to use, or artistic method, because it also brings to mind, though, you know, we all have rituals in our lives, but also the idea of rituals which in societies, indigenous societies, which acknowledge nature very differently, where the relationships, as we well know, are very differently constructed, and hence they change the whole way in which the non-human nature is treated, in a sense, or related with.
Mhm.
And I often argue that the only way out is to create new ontological shifts, because in the current trajectories, we are just doing more of the same.
Yeah.
The,
And I 100% agree. Yeah.
and shifting that requires another strategy in other ways. And I really do believe artists are the people who are going to shift this.
Yeah.
Because of it requires a non-disciplinary approach to do that, in a sense. And so is that, are you planning now, are you have documented sort of a set of rituals? Are those rituals going to now embody other lives? Can they create another kind of meter, in a sense?
Yeah, I think
Do you have any plans for that, of creating the glossary of rituals?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the pieces of work that Andres and myself were actually planning to do. We actually, I'm sure many at the academics that might tune into this will recognize that we had a wonderful project put together, but didn't receive support to go forward. Nonetheless, this glossary, what I'm interested at this particular moment in time of doing is to look at all of the, we have many examples that exist, as you say, in traditional and indigenous, and in our own cultures as well, our own indigenous cultures, of these types of practices that we did in a more rhythmic kind of habitual way, in a seasonal way, or in a weekly way, or in a daily way. And that I think is part of the work, almost a database, as you say, or a glossary, to sort of go to remind us as well. It's like, hey, people, we did do this, and we do this, and just put it to the front rather than putting it to the back. It's the whole, what's the weak story, what's the strong story that gets told. It's the consistent feminist kind of critique, really, in a sense. Flip it, because we do these things. It's just reminding ourselves that we also do these things. So this is one part of the work. The other part of the work at the moment for me as well is, now I feel I'm getting some sense of this kind of territory in a way, and I'm understanding what it means to step into holding ritual in a more kind of classic way as well. So I'm actually, going into the ritual studies kind of literature quite a lot, and that brings me in territory of reading and equally writing. And then with the practice, then it's the spatial arrangements within this and what it constitutes. And this kind of brings me into a finer line of what I would probably have traditionally called set design. What are the symbolic artifacts? What are the kind of elements that I'm playing with? What are the ones that I can play with that are suiting to my strengths, which is both performance and spoken word, I would say, but also then working with objects and what it is to kind of create those objects and what form that they take, and how do I work with other people in making those, so that there's also resonance there. What is that kind of communal community practice? This is also a big part of what we were also discussing and trying to kind of work out. So how do you co-create some of these ritual objects with groups that then enable their performativity to kind of happen? And then how do you potentially create kind of like, I don't want to say templates, but like sort of like possibilities for people then to kind of hold their own in a small way on a one-to-one level that you might be able to do in your home or your house, but then maybe in a more communal way with your community or your local community. So these are things that are sort of like swirling around at this moment in time, that are kind of thinking through these things. And I think that the other side I would say around this, and you may remember, but I have also this formal background in psychology, and this, I think, has brought me back into a full circle with the discipline that I would have said I had sort of, I don't want to say left, but because it's always been a strong, I think, foundational beat somehow, but it has brought me very much back into the particular field of psychology that is sort of eco-psychology and climate psychology. And again, rubbing up with professionals and experts in that space, where they're also looking to what are called these more effective strategies to addressing climate denial. And then this, triggers for me your picture around extinction, because this was, again, I think, post that museum moment that I spoke to you about in Vienna. I wrote this little piece called Liquid Loss, and how do we deal with the grief and the loss.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is also something that resonated then when I had written that piece. Then, Extinction Rebellion sort of emerged out of a context in Bristol and Stroud, where you kind of started to have this actual public, mass public kind of movement that was beginning to do almost funeral rites as well within part of their protest, demanding government wake up kind of calls, and so the Red Brigade, for example, which are the clowns, I'd say clowns, but the performances, they come from a clowning background. They were part of the crew in Bristol as well. And so I started to kind of look at these artistic practices that were very much using sort of modes of ritual for thinking about loss, because I started to also feel that, again, if we take an argument that on some level, if we take the argument that we are all deeply interconnected,
mm-hmm.
in that sort of, I'm just thinking of the wonderful scientist, her name's just right gone out of my head. She worked with James Lovelock on the Gaia theory a lot. You know who I mean. But the interconnectedness of all human beings, right? And if there is this great loss, I think we feel it. We do feel it. So again, what practices do we start to create and inhabit so that we can deal with the grief, because grief is real and it's a legitimate thing. And if you don't acknowledge grief,
mm-hmm.
if you don't call it what it is, right, it becomes pathologized. It's going to lead to an awful lot of nonsense, and it's going to lead to further schizoness, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the other thing that I think that these practices, these rituals, these performances actually sort of do function, they have a functional element as well. It's not just about this, it goes back to a question you asked me about why in an urban space, what are they doing? What does this do?
Mm-hmm.
I think it also can help that, help might be a big word to say, but it also ties to that as well.
Interesting. Well, this has been a great conversation, Teresa. Really wonderful conversation. Thank you very much for it. And your practice sounds really fascinating because it's so rooted in actually trying to change something, including in your artistic practice, and so I'm sure I'll get to see it live one day, which I'd love to.
Yeah, change. Thank you for those words of encouragement. It's an inquiry, isn't it, Ravi? You know yourself, these things take a really long time, and there's always it's like nudge, 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 nudge,
It take long because it's so radically different from what is there. That's why they take long.
But can I ask one thing about your picture of the horse here? What ceremony is this referring to, actually?
So this is a community of people who keep horses on the riverfront, and they look after them because these are marriage horses. as you know, in India, horses are part of marriage ceremonies where the bridegroom goes to the bride's house, mounted on a horse.
Yeah.
So they care for them. I was particularly struck watching this particular man because it was so much care and love to look after that horse and to dress it up almost. So these kinds of caring relationships we find in many societies which are still have a lot of tradition in them, because these are kind of marriage rituals, you know. But we also see them. I mean, the reason I asked you the question about urban spaces, and of course you write on them, is because also in what we call non-urban spaces, where animals have been part of people's lives, people's homes, they're like children.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Radhika Govindraj, in her book Animal Intimacies, writes about them.
Yeah, yeah.
In the Himalayas. And it's fascinating to read about how these relationships are almost familial relationships
Yeah.
with animals. And I think they translate back when we talk of our relationship with pets and animals in our backyard also. The recurring bird nests which occur on my back terrace, or the family of squirrels, or the families of squirrels which visit me because I have this terrace garden, and of course cut through my clothes, but you know, so be it, in a sense. So these are sort of create another kind of relationship, almost transformative and transporting relationships. Remind us of our other selves, in a sense, or our multiple selves, in us, and almost like we live in conflicted and multiple ontologies of behavior. We're not one self. We have different relationships with different kinds of things.
So I think this point on plurality is really like the central to kind of end on. But before we close, there's one thing I wanted to ask, because the other night I watched this really beautiful movie called The River. I don't know if you know it. It's an Indian film from 1951 or something. And it reminded me, of course, a lot of the work, because it opens with a fisherman.
Yeah.
Very close in the camera, making the net, right? And he's also singing. Right. And if you don't know the movie, it's so also.
I'm going to look it up. Yeah.
Have a look. Yeah. But the other thing is that it opened up with this interesting, like little opening. What would you call it? Anecdote. I don't know. A little opening that was kind of, I was super struck by, it triggered like the preparation, also in some ways not preparation, but this, I knew that we were having this conversation today. The kolam, the designs that people would make.
The rice made of colored rice powder outside homes in South India.
Exactly. And then of course I started to have a little kind of, I was just struck by the patterns and everything, and coming from this Tamil Nadu kind of area as well. And when I first went to India, this was the area that I also spent probably the most time in. But they were also explaining that these geometric designs that people make also draw in the animals sometimes, because maybe the birds might peck at the rice, or they get delayed from going into the house, kind of because the little creatures that might be scrambling on your floor might just end up eating whatever the rice flour, and it's sort of also, but it's also acknowledging those relations of interspecies relations, and I thought,
yeah, right. No, I don't want to say, yeah.
But this is the exact kind of practice that I'm speaking about,
I understood that when you mentioned, because I think there are many existing interspecies and multi-species coexistences, which are very much part of everyday life, especially in transitional societies like like here than when I live in. In many parts of the world, they have been completely wiped out. And here I just have to walk, just around the corner to see a practice like that. In Europe, I'll have to take a journey across many, many mountains to visit that place. So I'm thinking there's an everydayness, but it's fast disappearing. Whereas at this point, we should be resurrecting it, because this is where the different answers lie.
Yes.
So that's why I find what you say with ritual, bringing rituals back into contemporary space is a complex thing, because it's almost, and it's almost sort of contesting the idea of modernity, of
Yes.
the living of modernity, and then you are sort of bringing it back, but you're also bringing it back with full engagement with the moment, because you're describing the plant and you're describing the reed and you're describing the parts of it. Is very much about science in a sense. So how do we make today's rituals which serve today's societies, because we are in the world we are in? I think that is a contemporary, that's an important question for me.
And I think it's really interesting that you bring up that point about modernity, because when we look at, what were the big, iconic sort of emblems of modernity, I'm thinking about architecture really, in a sense, that just, the minimalism that almost denied the relationality with the local.
Right.
To keep these clean lines, this pure form. And, big fan of all of that, but we need to sort of
re-inhabit that.
Exactly.
Because many of these were aided by technology and machines, which are all part of industry and modernity in a sense. So the materials which became available made those buildings possible.
Yes.
If those materials were not there, then those buildings could not be constructed.
Yes. And I really take away a line that you spoke to when we wear equally our hats from the other project that we work on, Repair Acts and Tales of Care and Repair, that the point that you made in the seminar with Alma and Moni at this particular time, that we are writing ourselves out. The human has been written out of the tech ecotopia kind of solutions that are happening.
Right.
And we need to write ourselves back in.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's a weird combination then that is going to be produced, I think. And I think that ritual has the kind of one capacity to do that, while at the same time holding the complexity and the technological space that we are in, Yeah.
So long as we keep all the possibilities of the human intact, then we have hope. But if we surrender the human to the one possibility of its relationship to the techno-capital, then every other hope of the human is lost, because the human always has so many arenas of engagement. But now, because of this over-dominant, so we are in we should fear losing ourselves more than anything else, because so long as we have ourselves in all our complexities, we can go anywhere we want, any direction we want. But we lose that, and we don't have that. We become one relationship dependent as we're becoming.
Yeah.
Then we're reducing ourselves.
Yes. And this does go back to these points around the disappearing interface in terms of technological, the dream of calm and ubiquitous technology was to essentially take away the point of the button and the press and the door and the click, essentially, because the ubiquity of it and the algorithmic logic of it, in a sense, wants somehow to be dictating the intelligence.
Right.
And so I think these are quite interesting. You know, we're going into another, I think, loop of a conversation that maybe is relevant to some of our other fields as well. But I think that it's these things all play into this conversation, and all play into this particular point, actually, regarding the ritualistic at this particular moment in contemporary life, because you cannot negate the power of you cannot negate the dominance of the tech, in a sense. And I was just speaking the other night to a colleague, kind of going, how do you hold that space while not negating the power of AI and machine logic, and knowing that, and working and operating in that space as well. Right. So it's kind of like the contemporary craft of holding the two, in a sense. Right. So yeah, thank you so much for
thank you
enabling this conversation and helping always to have that conversation, to refine thoughts, and to refine thoughts. I really appreciate it, Ravi.
No, it's wonderful talking to you.